How is Cuba different than the US and Canada? How can a third world country have things like free education and health care, while in the US and Canada, people are increasingly paying more for these basic needs, with at least 60 million people in the US living without health care? This year, myself, Sophie,
Nicole,
and Allison
made a decision to see Cuba for ourselves, to try and answer these and other questions, and to show our support for Cuba against the U.S. government's aggression towards this sovereign country.
We traveled with the Pastors for Peace Friendshipment Caravan to Cuba, which every year breaks the U.S. blockade by bringing humanitarian goods to the island. It also breaks a U.S.-imposed travel ban on American citizens going to Cuba.
We joined the 2006 Caravan at the U.S.-Canada border on June 18th. Here we began our 15-day journey through the United States. The first challenge was the U.S.-Canada border crossing, where we openly declared that we were carrying humanitarian aid and people through the United States on our way to Cuba. We had a rally and send-off with lots of support from people from Canada and the U.S., and made it through the border with no trouble.
The aid we collected along the way included such necessities as common medical supplies, incubators, ultrasound machines, and prescription lenses, along with bicycles, sports equipment, computers, and education supplies.
We traveled with 10 other people on our bus, of all ages and backgrounds, who we picked up along the road. We were on one of 13 caravan routes that crossed North America, hitting more than 120 cities in 2 weeks. Every night we held public meetings about the caravan and Cuba, meeting all kinds of people: workers, students, senior citizens, community organizers, some who didn't know anything about the blockade, some who have been long-time Cuba Solidarity activists, and others, Cuban Americans, supportive of the work of the caravan.
We participated in media events, a chance to publicize the facts about the immoral and unjust blockade on Cuba and the caravan to communities that we visited through interviews with local television syndicates, radio, or newspapers.
About halfway along the road, we met a young woman. She had been homeless and traveling across the U.S. ever since Hurricane Katrina. We listened to her story of struggle and strength and talked about the differences between the U.S. and Cuba, about how Cuba offered to send 1,500 fully equipped doctors to help the victims of the Katrina disaster, which the Bush administration refused. Pastors for Peace also offered support for the victims of the hurricane, taking aid and volunteers to New Orleans.
On July 2nd, we met up with more than 100 other caravanistas in McAllen, Texas for orientation. We had come from all over the US, Canada, Mexico, and Europe, and were finally gathered together. We were youth, elders, artists, authors, musicians, filmmakers, students, healthcare workers, lawyers, pastors, and clergy. There were 4 days of preparation, including aid packing and vehicle repair, as well as meetings about what to expect in Cuba and crossing the border, and a press conference announcing our final departure.
Then we left for the border challenge at the U.S.-Mexico border. All the vehicles lined up to declare our intentions to travel to Cuba with humanitarian aid and break U.S. law, not knowing quite what to expect from the U.S., since on some caravans, U.S. Customs has seized some aid. But this year, we were at the border very early, and the understaffed border guards were not prepared for us, so we made it through without a hitch.
Our next stop was Tampico, where we helped load 100 tons of aid into shipping containers destined for Cuba. We'd like to think that we worked really hard loading those boxes, but the great bulk of the job was done by the Tampico dock workers, who every year volunteer to load the humanitarian aid from Pastors for Peace onto the barge.
The next morning we left for Cuba, touching down, the entire airplane full of caravanistas erupting into cheers and tears. We spent the next 8 days in Havana and in the provinces. We stayed in accommodation in the heart of Havana, in dorms inside Cuban churches, and at an internationalist camp in Havana province.
We saw museums, historical sites, hospitals, and schools, the highlight of which was the Latin American School of Medicine, where over 23,000 students from all over Latin America and Africa are being trained as doctors for free. There are also 500 spots open for students from the U.S. to attend the school. Pastors for Peace is the organization in the U.S. that promotes this opportunity for U.S. citizens from poor and minority communities to attend the school, and many people who could only dream of being able to go to medical school have been given the opportunity through Pastors for Peace and the Cuban government.
We also experienced Cuban healthcare firsthand with a visit to the emergency room at the school. Just a slight case of the tourist stomach, but a quick recovery and excellent care. All for free with no questions asked except name and age.
It was very inspiring learning about the internationalism of the Cuban Revolution. For instance, we learned about Operation Miracle, where over 500,000 people from Cuba, Venezuela, and other parts of Latin America have had their vision returned to them through cataract removal operations done at no cost in Cuba. And we got to watch live TV of the surgeries.
We had the opportunity to meet with representatives from all levels of Cuban government, as well as from Cuban mass organizations such as the Federation of Students. We saw firsthand the young people and women organizing their communities and continuing the fight to bring the gains of the Cuban Revolution forward. We also got to hear Ricardo Alarcon, president of the National Assembly of People's Power.
Large amounts of the aid we brought to Cuba was destined for children with special needs. We visited a school for children with visual impairments, a school with more faculty and staff than students, and got to see directly the challenges the blockade presents, but also the amazing resilience of the Cuban people and their determination for excellent and accessible education for all.
Hip-hop is on the rise in Cuba as an exciting form of art and expression. Twice we got to go to hip-hop concerts and talk to the young Cuban artists about their experiences and opinions in living the Cuban Revolution. But this year, the opportunity is going to be even greater, with some actual and aspiring hip-hop artists from the U.S. traveling with the Pastors for Peace Caravan, and special workshops and shows featuring collaborations between Caravanistas and Cuban MCs and DJs, a hip-hop exchange of friendship and solidarity.
Our challenge wasn't over when we left Cuba on the airplane. On the reverse challenge, we crossed the border into the U.S., openly declaring that we had all traveled to Cuba, but refusing to answer any of their further interrogations. The questioning took many hours, but all of us made it back into the U.S. and to Vancouver, full of inspiration and ideas to continue the fight against the immoral and unjust U.S. blockade.